Organization of the real estate brokerage industry. There are two aspects of the organization of the real estate brokerage industry in British Columbia. Number one, the organizational structure created by the statutory regulation of the industry, and two, the voluntary structure created by the variety of professional organizations that exist to fulfill objectives not addressed by government regulation. In Canada, the Constitution divides the power to make laws between the federal and the provincial governments. The provinces have sole jurisdiction to make laws concerning property and civil rights, education, municipal organization, professions, and licensing, and all matters of a purely local nature. Consequently, all statutory laws relating directly to land and the licensing of real estate brokerage personnel are provincial, with each province passing legislation to effect its own regulatory purposes. A general overview of the framework which exists in British Columbia is presented in this section. Participation in professional organizations, while not mandatory, is an important part of the operation of the real estate industry. A brief discussion of these voluntary organizations is also presented. Statutory regulation. The bulk of provincial government regulation of the operation of the British Columbia real estate brokerage industry is embodied in the Real Estate Services Act, which is discussed in detail in a later chapter. The Real Estate Services Act. The major concern of the Real Estate Services Act is the protection of the public. This objective is achieved in part by licensing the people who derive their income from acting as agents for parties involved in the real estate market. It is also achieved through the existence of a mandatory insurance scheme whereby all licensees, and therefore the public, are protected from financial loss due to errors and omissions. The Real Estate Services Act establishes the Real Estate Council of British Columbia as a self-regulating organization with direct jurisdiction over the regulation of real estate licensees. The Act provides the Council with the power to make bylaws and rules that govern all aspects of licensing and generally ensure that the Council can quickly respond to changes in the real estate marketplace in order to better serve and protect consumer interests. The early 1980s in British Columbia were a time of great volatility in the real estate market. One of the consequences of this volatility was a sharp increase in the number of errors and omissions claims being made against real estate licensees. At the same time as claims were increasing, the insurance industry was going through one of its periodic tight market cycles. The result was that licensees, even those with excellent claims histories, found that errors and omissions insurance had suddenly become much more expensive and difficult, if not impossible, to obtain. In fact, more than 50% of the licensees in the province were operating without any errors and omissions coverage at all. Out of this background came the impetus which culminated in the British Columbia Real Estate Association and the Real Estate Council forming a joint real estate errors and omissions insurance committee to explore the liability insurance options open to the real estate industry. The goal of the committee was to find an affordable way to protect licensees from financial loss due to error and omissions. The result was the creation of the Real Estate Errors and Omissions Insurance Corporation. Discussion of the roles and responsibilities of licensees together with coverage of the errors and omissions insurance system are dealt with later in this course. Introduction to the statutory and voluntary organization of the real estate industry. The organized real estate industry in the province of British Columbia dates back to the early part of the 20th century. The Vancouver region was the first to organize when, in 1919, the Vancouver Real Estate Exchange, now the Real Estate Board of Greater Vancouver, was formed. The Real Estate Board of Victoria was the next to organize in 1922. Both of these organizations were concerned with the need to raise the standards of practice by real estate salespeople in the province for the better protection of the public. This concern was taken up by government, and in 1920, the first real estate licensing legislation was passed setting minimum standards of conduct for licensees. By 1949, there were numerous voluntary real estate boards in the province. The boards went on to establish the British Columbia Association of Real Estate Boards, which later evolved into present-day organizations such as the British Columbia Real Estate Association, BCREA, and the Real Estate Institute of British Columbia, REI-BC. As the number of licensees increased, a new system of administration was required. The Real Estate Act was amended in 1950 to establish the Real Estate Agents Licensing Board and to require applicants to pass qualifying examinations as a licensing prerequisite. The BC Institute of Real Estate Agents was formed in 1957, and the members were elected by licensed members of the association. The Institute was the forerunner of the modern Real Estate Institute and, subsequently, the BCREA. It was not until 1958 that the then new Real Estate Act was passed. The Act provided for the appointment of the first Real Estate Council of British Columbia to act as advisor to the Superintendent of Insurance, who was responsible for enforcing and administering the Act and its regulations. The directors of the Institute were appointed as council members. In 1962, the BC Real Estate Agents Association merged with the Real Estate Institute. New bylaws were adopted to provide for three divisions: the Provincial Division, which was responsible for electing 15 members to the Real Estate Council, the Realtor Division, and the Professional Division. In 1967, each of the latter divisions developed into separate organizations known today as the Real Estate Council, BCREA, and the Real Estate Institute. Descriptions of each organization follow in the next section. Figure. Preface 2. Organization of the real estate brokerage industry in British Columbia, starting on the left side. Statutory organization. The Financial Institutions Commission, operating within the Ministry of Finance and Corporate Relations, is responsible for real estate matters in British Columbia by way of the Real Estate Services Act. The Real Estate Errors and Omissions Insurance Corporation was created and charged with insuring licensees against liability for errors and omissions made during the course of their professional duties. The Superintendent of Real Estate and the Real Estate Council, who are responsible for the licensing of real estate service providers and the general protection of the public. So the Real Estate Errors and Omissions Insurance Corporation, it provides mandatory insurance coverage. So we go over a little bit to the right, to the middle. The Superintendent of Real Estate and the Real Estate Council, who are responsible for the licensing of real estate service providers and the general protection of the public. Down arrow, provide for pre- and post-licensing education and licensing of service providers. And if we go over to the far right, it says voluntary. The Canadian Real Estate Association, CREA, a national organization of provincial real estate boards, licensees, and real estate organizations. It's represented in British Columbia by the BC Real Estate Association, BCREA, which promotes continuing education of its member real estate boards and the advancement of causes important to its members. And the down arrow says it creates and administers continuing professional education. So all these, the statutory organizations, the voluntary, all real estate brokerages and their related licensees are subject to this.